Hello, hello. I hope you can hear me. Had some trouble last week. I think my audio is working this week. Welcome to another Tiny Desk Sermon. We're going to look at the text for this coming Sunday, which is Lectionary 26. And if you were wondering if it was safe to come back to worship and not have to hear any more really difficult parables and any more talk about wealth and money, I'm sorry, it's not safe yet to come back. But that's because Luke's gospel has a lot about those themes in it. So, we'll see what we can do to make the most of it. I'm going to start with Amos. The first reading has a lot of resonance with the gospel reading. It's short, so let's listen to this. Alas for those who are at ease in Zion, and for those who feel secure on Mount Samaria. Alas for those who lie on beds of ivory and lounge on their couches, and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the stall, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp, and like David improvise on instruments of music, who drink wine from bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. Therefore they shall now be the first to go into exile, and the revelry of the loungers shall pass away. Thank you, Barbara. Glad you can hear me. Thanks for letting me know. All right, so again, Amos is this very early prophet who went from the southern kingdom to the northern kingdom to give a warning as a word of God. Now, the nation of Israel, after Solomon, got divided in two, the north and the south, and the northern kingdom was the first to be sent into exile. And I'm going to test myself here. Sometime around 722, I believe. And Amos is prophesying that is what's going to happen to them if they don't figure out how to change their ways. And he's a prophet speaking to the wealthy. And as you can see from this really, I think, wonderful set of images, the wealthy are quite comfortable. They feel secure. They are at ease. They lie on beds of ivory. Imagine what a bed of ivory would cost. They lounge on their couches. I picture somebody like on a white chaise lounge, just relaxed and drinking a glass of wine. They eat lambs from the flock and calves from the stall, so they're wealthy enough to eat the meat of the animals rather than use the animals merely to produce other things. They sing idle songs. They drink wine, they anoint themselves, but they're not grieved over what's happening. So they have, I think, comforted themselves to the point of not having to think about the difficulties, the struggles, the problems, the needs of others. And that's why this text is so relevant to the gospel reading. All right. And it's not an easy ending to the text. Like, the good times are coming to an end, folks, so you might as well try to figure it out now. Okay, so the gospel reading from Luke 16. We've been in chapter 16 already in the Sunday readings, and it's been all about dealing with issues of wealth and money and how the poor are the focus of God's compassion and mercy. Jesus has been talking to some folks, some Pharisees, and these particular Pharisees are described as lovers of money. I think it's very important not to hear that text as this general description of all Pharisees are lovers of money, or certainly how that would then be applied to say all Jews are lovers of money, which is where the anti-Semitic interpretations of these texts tend to go. So I'm going to be very cautious about that. But his audience is his disciples, And these Pharisees who are curious about what he's teaching and are listening in, and they don't seem to like these challenging words about the poor and the wealthy. So the text. Jesus said, "There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, 'Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames.' But Abraham said, 'Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us.' He said, 'Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment.' Abraham replied, 'They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them.' He said, 'No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent.' He said to him, 'They do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced even if someone rises from the dead.'" All right. Well, let's do a little walkthrough in this text here. First of all, very interesting details at the beginning. There was a rich man, and sometimes in the tradition, this rich man is known as, and I never know how you pronounce it, Dives or Dives, or one of the, it's capital Dives. That is sometimes in the tradition assumed to be this person's name. However, that's just the word for rich man. And it's important, I think, for this parable to see that the rich man is not named. Dressed in purple and fine linen. This is not just an accidental notion or notation of his fashion sense or his appearance. Purple and fine linen are signs of the great wealth of this man. As you may know, purple was, I think, the most expensive dye in the ancient world. I think really up until the 19th century, when a synthetic purple was discovered. And one of the reasons it was so expensive is it was made from sea snails, and they had to collect lots and lots of them just to get an ounce of the dye. And they would like boil them in a like a lead pot for days and days and days, and process these snails and all this stuff, and that's how they got purple dye. So it was very costly to produce. A lot of it came from the region called, now we know as Phoenicia, which was also known as Tyre. And the word Phoenicia actually can mean the land of purple. So this interesting little detail would immediately tell the audience then, oh, this guy has a lot of money. Like if we were to say, there was a rich man who drove a Lamborghini, or there was a rich man who had a mansion up on the hills over Lake Austin. Just an automatic signal that, okay, this is not just somebody who's doing okay, he's got a lot of money. It feasts sumptuously every day. So just like in the Amos reading, the ability to feast sumptuously is a sign of wealth. at his gate. So we see that he lives in a gated property. So he has some kind of separation from the poor, the common person. There's a poor man named Lazarus. So this is again important. The poor man is named, the rich man is not. This is already a tell in the story of where the priority is. And Lazarus is covered in sores, and he's hungry, and he wants to just eat the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table, and the dogs come out. It's gross, right? It's gross. And the poor man died. So we get a sense here that the rich man is living such a separate, comfortable life that he doesn't even see Lazarus at his gate. Now, apparently, in the ancient world, there was a tradition of a wealthy people having a bench outside their gate, where poor people could come and sit, and when the people would eat, they would bring them some of the food because they were hungry. Lazarus is so sick, he's not even sitting on the bench. He is laying at the gate. But the rich man is so comfortable, so within his own safe experience, he doesn't apparently even see Lazarus. It's not like he went out to the gate and said, Lazarus, go away, or Lazarus had asked him for something and he said no. You could perhaps presume that has happened, but in terms of the story, it's just the rich man just doesn't even notice him. So the poor man died, and he was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. That's a very different notion of what happens when one dies, especially in Jewish tradition. When you die, you are laid in the ground, and you kind of are in a sort of a nothingness state until the resurrection. Here, the Lazarus is so beloved and so honored that he is carried away to Abraham. But the rich man is buried. So he dies a normal human death, and then he ends up in Sheol or Hades, or the place of the dead prior to resurrection. And in this particular interpretation, it says Hades, and therefore it comes with some of these Greek notions of a place where there's fire and other things. So also the notion of going to be with Abraham was this ancient Jewish symbol of comfort, of going to be at the bosom of Abraham, to be sort of embraced and welcomed. Is a powerful, rich imagery for this story. So this is also very telling that the rich man, who's now ended up in a very bad place, and somehow, I don't know how, he knows that Lazarus is sitting by Abraham's bosom, and he is quite jealous, perhaps. What does he do? He calls Father Abraham to order Lazarus to do his bidding. Send Lazarus to dip his finger in the water and cool my tongue, as if Lazarus were still sort of beneath him, even though clearly Lazarus, if you do an upper and lower, carried away versus buried view of the mythical universe, Lazarus has been elevated and the rich man has been brought low. But he still has this presumption that Lazarus is there to serve him because he's a rich, important man. And Abraham says, remember when you had it so good and Lazarus' life was pretty awful? Well, now Lazarus is comforted and you're in agony. Besides all this, there's a great chasm between us, and it's fixed, and we can't do anything about it now. and then to continue this sort of presumptuousness, The rich man says, "Then, Father, I beg you, send Lazarus to my father's house." So, still, like thinking that he can order Lazarus, he doesn't even seem to know Lazarus or even have any connection to him, but he can order him around. Abraham says, they have Moses and the prophets, just like you did. Um, so they should listen, because Moses and the prophets, like Amos, say how we treat people who are poor and in need and sick matters. And then we get this curious ending about, well, if somebody goes to them from the dead, they will repent. Um, and Abraham says, even if someone rises from the dead. So we get a little foreshadowing of the resurrection of Jesus and whether the resurrection of Jesus convinces us of anything. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. It's just a little foreshadowing. All right, so what do we do with all this? I do think one of the primary themes, both in Amos and in Luke, is the way wealth allows us to comfort ourselves to the point of being numb to the suffering around us. And if we find ourselves feeling like we are the ones with purple linen, and I think I'm going to wear my purple linen shirt on Sunday to try to remind myself of this parable and what it means. Uh, if we find ourselves in that situation, then maybe this parable is sort of a wake-up call parable. But if we find ourselves among those who are being left outside the gate, those who are hungry, sick, neglected, this might sound like really, really good news. Finally, if it didn't happen in this lifetime, finally Lazarus gets some mercy. So it's curious if how you react to this parable kind of tells you where you position yourself in the parable, because it's a great story for Lazarus. It's a great story for anybody who doesn't have wealth and depends on other people to be generous, and when they're not generous, they suffer. But I imagine most of us hear this like maybe the Pharisees who were near Jesus, the ones who loved money, heard this, which is, that doesn't sound right, that doesn't sound fair, that's not good for me, what do I do about this? So again, these parables, it's perhaps tempting to try to interpret everything in it in some literal way, and then try to figure out specifically what it means or where each thing lines up. But again, the goal of these parables in general, is to kind of work in us and challenge us to rethink how we understand God and ourselves and the world, so we might see how the good news works. Now, one way to understand this, I think, this parable, and a lot of Luke's gospel, is through, believe it or not, the theme of comedy. Classical Greek comedy, which was sort of created in Greek theater, I think maybe around the 5th century forward. And classical comedy ever since then, including Shakespeare and including many movies made today and stories, it always involves, or frequently involves, this theme of a great reversal. And the poor lowly person in the story, who is always, nothing's ever going right for this person, and the rich and wealthy are treating him terrible. Something happens in the story and creates this great reversal, so that by the end of the comedy, it's intentionally silly and ridiculous that this lowly poor person should end up at the top, and the wealthy powerful person who is not treating them well ends up at the bottom. That's a central theme of comedy. And comedy is, kind of speaks to the masses, kind of speaks to the common person. And through often ridiculous scenarios and making especially the rich and powerful look foolish, there's a sense of lifting up the common person, the lowly person, with a different kind of dignity. And so I think this parable could be read through the lens of comedy, through saying that the real heart of this is not the sort of dire circumstances of the rich man at the end, as if and where our minds, I know, go is we give it sort of a translation into our sort of heaven and hell dichotomy in some Christian tradition. The rich man was bad and he went to hell to be forever tormented in the flames. It sounds like that. But I don't think that's the real focus or even point of this parable, is to establish some sort of cosmology of heaven and hell, and that that you have to kind of be righteous enough to get in to be at Abraham's side. This is really about how do you respond to Lazarus being lifted up, and if the parable says that Lazarus is lifted up in his death, then how might Lazarus be lifted up before his death? Because the whole Gospel of Luke says God's focus, God's concern, God's compassion, and God's mercy and God's energy are for the poor and the lowly. And God is lifting them up in Christ in all kinds of ways. How do we respond to that lifting up? So the parable, I think, rather than, leading us to fret about whether we end up in Hades or at Abraham's bosom, is to wake us up to say, how do I respond to this great reversal? Do I respond to it with fear and anxiety, this lifting up of the lowly, which doesn't happen much in this world? Or do I respond to it with joy, even laughter, and with participation in it, welcoming it? Because the parable is not, it's not a literal story. It's not meant for the brothers and father of the rich man who still need to figure it out. It's meant for the hearers to be transformed by it. So I think hearing it as a comic reversal story helps us reframe how to listen to the parable. And if we find ourselves identifying with the rich man, then what does the parable do to us? If we find ourselves identifying with Lazarus, what does the parable do to us? And if we find ourselves kind of maybe appropriately on both sides of the story at different times, then maybe we can hear it for what it's meant to be. I saw a website recently about, now I can't remember what it's called. Something about how rich am I, or something like that. And you put in your annual household income, and then it tells you where you are in the ranking in the world, of what percentage you're in wealth or in income in the world. And of course, in the United States, we have so much more wealth than we realize, that it's shocking to find out that if your household income is $60,000, you're in the top 8% of the world. If your household income is in the six figures, you're getting into the top 1% of the world. And that is not uncommon in the United States. So, we do have to be willing to say, we have a great deal of wealth, most of us, even those of us that are not as well off as some are in our society. We're all much better off than many people in the world. And so how does our wealth and our comfort, our comfortable lifestyle we have carefully crafted for ourselves, how does it numb us to hearing the needs of others? Because we can turn off the TV, we can pour ourselves a glass of wine, we can take our anti-anxiety medications, we can go behind our gated communities, we can do all these things that simply allow us to ignore, to not see. And so I think this parable helps us say, what do we need to remove? What gates do we need to open, if we take the parable of the rich man, in order to be able to see Lazarus? I pretty easy to get wrapped up in our own lives and challenges without thinking of others. It is, and we do, and that's our human nature. It's our sinful nature. So, of course, as gospel-centered people, we don't hear this parable as saying something as trite or as unhelpful as if you don't help poor people, you're going to Hades. That's just too simplistic and not gospel-centered. So again, within a context of a people who have already been promised eternal grace and love, then maybe that is what unnumbs us. Living by God's grace can free us to see the need of our neighbor around us. And of course, as a community that gathers around the central symbol of the cross, we are constantly pulled in to focusing on the suffering in the world. If we see the cross as Jesus in solidarity with the suffering of the world, including your suffering and mine, but especially those who are persecuted or poor or facing great suffering. If you see God as being in solidarity through Christ with the suffering of the world, then the cross constantly pulls us out of our numb, comfortable lives and to dare to look at the suffering of the world, the Lazaruses of the world, and to say, now, where is God calling me in this, to use whatever I have to be a part of the healing of the world. The challenge is deciding what is enough for the days that are left and how much and to whom the rest should be shared. That's a great point, Barbara, and that's the challenge of being faithful stewards of what we have. And we shouldn't think it's simple to figure that out, but it's being willing to engage with the question and then make a decision is important. And in our society, when you retire, you are going to have, you may retire with a fixed pension, so you have a guaranteed income, and you may get a annual percentage increase in that. But you might more often retire with a 401k or a 403b or c, I forget what it is that I have for nonprofits. And then you have to make very wise decisions about how you use your money when you're retired. That doesn't mean you don't have the capacity to use your retirement as a way to help those in need, but also know that you have needs. And you have to be responsible about that, not sort of like, I'm going to retire, I'm going to give it all away in the first year, and then what? You've got Social Security and nothing. So I don't think any of us should tell anybody else what some easy answer is to what this means. I think we can encourage one another to be as faithful as possible in how we live out our life of using our wealth to further God's purposes, but especially to be willing to be constantly drawn out of our safety, of our comfort, of our security, and be in touch with, to connect to the Lazaruses of the world. That's hard, and that's something we have to choose to do. But I think as people that gather in front of the cross, it keeps calling us, this is not a choice, this is actually where God is. There, I did it, I'm done. So, I am starting a new adult class this coming Tuesday evening on Zoom. It's called something like The Church Standing in the Gap, How to Have Difficult Conversations. I hope you'll consider joining me. We're going to look at some biblical texts, but we're also going to look at some resources to say, what are effective ways to have conversations around big disagreements we may have with other people? And for what purpose do we do that? And how can we approach it in a way that might help us understand each other better and create more relationships rather than more division? So I hope you consider joining me. There's information about that in the weekly email that went out today, and the Zoom meeting link is at the bottom of that email. All right, thank you for joining me for another Tiny Desk, and hope to see you sometime soon. Peace.